All right. Good morning, Dad.
Good morning.
Today is Wednesday, March 26th. And before we jump into it, I just want to say, thanks to everybody that subscribed. I'm sure you've noticed, Dad, that our channel has been growing and
So I
people,
hear.
yeah, people like what you have to say. Uh, you have a great way of explaining things, and it's not really just confined to geopolitics. When I was growing up, we didn't really talk much geopolitics. It was more life stuff, anything from like chemistry homework to relationships, or just anything I had in my mind. And you always were really good at just explaining it in a very calm way that's easy to digest. And so I think it's great that I'm able to share your thoughts with the world. But I don't necessarily want to confine it just to these topics. I know that's what people are subscribing to us for. But I've started a YouTube membership program. Anybody can join for $2.99 a month, and the idea is that once a month I'll do another talk with my dad, but we'll explore different topics, things that are suggested by people that join the community. And I think it'll be just a fun way for myself to learn and grow, and other people as well that join the community. So if you're interested in doing that, you can click join on the YouTube thing. It's $2.99 a month. And yeah, I'm excited to see how it goes. And of course, it will support us to continue to do this podcast. Now that it's growing, I'm thinking that maybe I can actually make this a full time thing at some point, which would be exciting for me. Um, okay, anyways, now that that's out of the way, we can jump into some news. So, Dad, what's on your mind? What's the biggest stuff?
The
Teach me.
biggest. Oh gosh. Um, well, I guess it's the negotiations that between the U.S. and Russia over the Black Sea and over energy infrastructure. There talks about two ceasefires. Now, the first one has been verbally agreed to by Putin and by Zelensky. But the Ukrainians clearly are violating it and doing so deliberately. I mean, there was some question in my mind early on whether or not it was deliberate. Because first, okay, Putin had agreed to it. The Russians said they even shot down their own drones um, to honor the ceasefire. But Zelensky went ahead and struck, another piece of energy infrastructure on Russian land, and then but, he had not verbally agreed to it at that point. But then he did. And after he did, following a phone call, or it was actually during a phone call with Trump, I believe, um, the Ukrainians struck the Suja metering station and did extensive damage there. Now, okay, again, this happened immediately afterwards. Maybe it was a rogue element. That's a thought that was out there and a thought that I had myself. But since then, it's just been constant. It's been intensifying. And according to the Russians, in the last 24 hours, there have been 3 attacks on energy infrastructure. That just cannot be a rogue element, a mistake. It's a deliberate effort to subvert this agreement. And I find that extraordinary because, um, again, it seems like there's an inability on the part of the Ukrainians to be flexible even when it's in their own interest. They might feel that this agreement is not helpful to them. I don't see that it really is. It probably is helpful because again, the Russians can do a lot more damage and have done a lot more damage. And maybe the only argument you can make is that the Russians have done so much damage to the Ukrainian infrastructure that there's not a whole lot left to hit. And so they feel like, okay, well, they already blew it up, so what does it matter? But there still is, there is that remaining 20% or something that the Russians could take out. But they're just inflexible. It's clear that this is going to damage the relationship, or it should anyway. If the Americans are at all sincere about this effort to, reach a ceasefire and eventually a settlement, the Americans have to be very angry about this. I think there's no question about it. And this has got to be putting, a real strain on the Ukraine-U.S. relationship. But the Ukrainians are doing it. Again, this is the guy, Zelensky, who who has the right outside of his office that big painting of the Kremlin in flames. I think we're just seeing Ukraine right here. It's almost like a death cult, incapable of compromise. It's just like we've just got to keep on killing Russians until the very end. I don't know how to explain it, because it does not seem to me to be at all in the interest of the Ukrainians. They could be, they could make a very, very minor concession. It really isn't any concession to speak of, and in that way, maintain a good relationship with the Americans. But the Americans, you would hope anyway, that they have to understand what's going on. They have to see that it is the Ukrainians that are violating it. And so I think the Russians themselves have not responded, though they have reserved the right to respond to these attacks. Obviously they would have the right to do it. The one side is violating it. They're keeping their side. And there are apparently a lot of Russians, of the kind of the more nationalist bent within Russia. They're quite upset about this. But I think the Russians are just using this maybe to educate the Americans. Say, look, you got just sort of like this foaming rabid dog in Ukraine, and you better get it on a tight leash. But I think this education can go different ways too. It may also be kind of a test, for the Russians. They say, can the Russians actually restrain these people? Restrain this foaming at the mouth rabid dog.
The Russians? You mean the Americans restrain Ukraine?
Yeah. I'm sorry. Did I say that? Yeah. Thanks for the correction. Right. The Russians are thinking, can the Americans restrain the Ukrainians? Because if they can't, then what's the point of going ahead with any of these talks? Correct.
Right.
So now we can kind of just shift over to the Black Sea and what's happening there. There were, I think, like 12 and a half hours of negotiations, very extensive negotiations in Riyadh, just a couple of days ago. And in the end, nothing concrete was achieved. There was all this very diplomatic language about many things were discussed. Creative solutions were offered. In other words, nothing was agreed to. It seems to me clear that the Russians are being very firm. They had a bad experience earlier. There was what was called the grain deal in the early months of the war. And, that was said, okay, the Russians will allow Ukraine to use the Black Sea to export grain to the rest of the world. We won't interfere with the shipping, but they can't use those ships to smuggle in arms. And then also we must be allowed to export grain, unhindered. And so, the Europeans and the U.S. had already imposed these sanctions, which made it very difficult, created all kinds of obstacles to the export of grain by Russia. Their agricultural bank was disconnected from SWIFT and so on and so forth. There are all kinds of sanctions. So, part of the deal was that those sanctions were supposed to be lifted, but they never were. And so finally the Russians said, we're out of here. So you have the Russians clearly have the ability to impose a real blockade on Ukraine, but they haven't. They occasionally will attack a ship. Mainly it's actually like when it's in the port and it's clear to them that there are a lot of, military equipment, on the ship, being unloaded, and then they will attack it. So sometimes they have damaged ships in that way, and there may be some other cases. But all in all, they've been letting the ships go through. And I think the reason is that a lot of countries are, dependent. Ukraine is still an important grain producer, a much smaller grain producer than Russia is, but it's still one of the world's major grain producers. And there's much of the world, especially the poorest part of the world, that's very dependent on those exports. So they have not imposed a blockade, even though it would make military sense for the Russians. So anyway, this would be an effort to allow for inspections of those ships, so that the Russians can verify that no munitions are being smuggled into Ukraine. And then it also would allow the Russians to export grain unimpeded. That was the idea of the original grain deal, and I think there's an attempt to do that again. And in a statement that the Americans made, they acknowledged these problems. It seemed like they accepted the reasonableness, but they just made this rather vague statement that we will help like Russia to have these obstacles removed. I think the problem is probably the Europeans. The Europeans are probably unwilling to do it. So I don't think there's a whole lot of hope that this Black Sea deal, this Black Sea ceasefire will actually be put into effect. And, the other ceasefire, the one on energy infrastructure, is already really have been torn to pieces by the Ukrainian side. That's what we're looking at right now.
You said that maybe the Russians were using this as an opportunity to educate the Americans on how difficult it is to deal with the Ukrainians, that they really have to restrain them. The Ukrainians are the ones that are breaking all these deals. Are they Russians trying to educate the Europeans as well, or are they just the Europeans such a lost cause at this point that they say basically they lump the European leaders in with Ukraine as crazy rabid dogs as well?
I think the latter is true. I think they really have written off the Europeans, with the exception of, again, Hungary and Slovakia at this point. The recent statements by Lavrov, are very much that effect. It's just like the Europeans are nuts, and there's just no point in talking to them right now. But they feel like there is a window of opportunity with the Americans. They, again, like the Americans, not the Americans, but the Russians in general have been much more cautious about the possibility of of a lasting ceasefire or a settlement or, substantive progress in these negotiations. You get statements on the American side, like, from Witkoff and from Trump, that a deal is right around the corner. You don't hear that on the Russian side. And I think the Russians are just being very realistic. They know what they're up against. But they do see benefit in having these talks. Partly, I think, like we're saying, I think we said this even months ago, that it's educational. I think it as a chance for them to really explain their position and open the eyes of the Americans to some of the problems, with Ukraine and Europe. And I think that's what we're getting out of it.
Well, if Ukraine and Europe don't want to play ball, then is peace pretty much impossible? Or will they slowly be educated themselves as the Americans understand and, don't want to support the Ukraine regime and the Europeans more and more? Will that just force the Europeans to be like, okay, we can't do this?
Yeah. Well, again, there's just at this point, there's virtually no evidence of any kind of realism on the European side. Maybe I'll offer one exception, and that is, okay, Keir Starmer has been making all these crazy statements. He's trying to be the new Churchill, which he, again, is, well, Macron was going to be the new Napoleon, right? But so he's been talking about, these grandiose plans, the rearming of Europe and the sending of troops to Ukraine and so on and so forth. Well, recently, actually, his own defense department, it came up, stated quite plainly that it was theater. That there just isn't any substance to what Keir Starmer is saying. So you'd see there is a bit of realism there. It's interesting that often you find the realism, the more realistic faction within the military, within the various defense departments. But that's just a small island. In general, these leaders are just, often their fantasy world. So, yeah, I don't, and they do seem to be just thoroughly dedicated to preventing peace from breaking out. And they have, very willing accomplices in Ukraine, unfortunately. Now, the Russians, for their part, I mean, there are a lot of Russians, again, the more nationalist bent, that have been afraid that the Russians are going to accept a bad deal, like another Minsk. They're going to allow the West to pull the wool over their eyes once again. But I don't think so. I think, Putin gave a very important speech to, I think it was the Union of Industrialists and Entrepreneurs. And it was mostly about Ukraine. And what he did is, again, he's repeated Again, the conditions that he had set out in June of last year, the four oblasts, Kherson, Zaporozhye, Donetsk, Lugansk, plus Crimea, those are Russian territory, and and that's over. That's settled. None of this is negotiable. No NATO, and also no banderism. That's the so-called denazification. All that has been restated consistently. There's no sign that the Russians are budging on this. And in fact, this time, this is the important thing, that he added some new conditions. That he said, okay, yeah, we're going to take those four oblasts. But not only that, we need recognition, international recognition from them. The U.S. must recognize them as Russian territory and Ukraine. And if they don't, and we're not going to wait forever, we're only going to give them a relatively brief period of time. We're not going to say, well, maybe 5 years down the road. But, if you don't do this within a brief period of time, we're going on. And we're going on to Odessa and Kharkov. So he said it. We've been wondering about there had been hints of that, but this time he laid it out. So he's actually even firmed up the threats. He's not going in the opposite direction. I think, they're obviously allowing the Ukrainians to get away with bloody murder in this energy infrastructure ceasefire. I think that's purposeful. It makes a lot of Russians mad, and I understand that. But I think it is, the Russians' leadership is calculating that this is going to, again, maybe open the eyes of the Americans. There's some reason to be, again, hopeful about these people, about the American negotiators.
Do you think that the U.S. would officially recognize those four oblasts? Would they do that?
I don't know. I think it would be very hard I think part of the problem too is, I'm not sure exactly what, but a lot of these agreements require, according to the U.S. Constitution, Senate ratification, and generally by a 2/3 majority. And I don't think that's possible right now. So I think it's, even if the administration goes out on a limb and does it, and that's within the realm of possibility. Again, we've heard these things, encouraging statements, not just one or two, but now, kind of accumulating number of statements that there is kind of a growing understanding within the administration of Russia's position. But, that in the end, they're going to have to, well, first of all, it really would be a firestorm. And especially if Trump just might decide it's not a fight that he wants to fight, but it's hard to predict anything about Trump. But even if he does, decide that, okay, we got to do this, bite the bullet, accept it. This is the only way to end this conflict. I think the Senate will prevent him from actually, officially recognizing those territories.
Yeah, I think it'd be very difficult. We already hear the screams of capitulation and appeasement and comparing him to Neville Chamberlain all over again. If he does this, you think those screams, those intensify 100-fold.
Right.
And it's interesting they say it needs Senate ratification, because it feels like with the United States, we kind of pick and choose due process, like what requires congressional approval, what requires Senate ratification. Apparently we're allowed to bomb countries and impose tariffs or do anything like this with executive orders. So I sometimes I wonder, like, do these things even hold things up? I don't know how much of a legitimate process we have in our government anymore. It seems like we're moving slightly more and more towards authoritarianism in a way as well. So
yeah, good point. But the Russians might demand it if they know that really, according to U.S. law, Senate ratification is required. They might demand it because they understand that, okay, well, Trump's term's going to end in 4 years, and who knows who's going to be there. I think there's at least a 50-50 chance it's going to be a Democrat, even though they're so unpopular, because there is a real chance that the economy could go south. And again, people vote their pocketbooks. And then if it was just Trump's word or, an executive order on the part of Trump, that can be easily done, on the first day of the new president's term. The Russians might demand, even if the U.S. is not willing to abide by its own constitution, the Russians might demand that it do so.
So everything you're saying is telling me that this war is going to continue. That likely the Russians, they didn't give a deadline, right? They didn't say how long until we need to have some type of international recognition of these roadblocks.
Right. But I think Putin just implied that it's not going to be it's relatively urgent. It's something that it needs to be addressed right away. That the Russians just can't wait around definitely for years. It's just so I don't think he actually set a deadline, but he implied that the Russian patience is limited.
So this probably means then you think Odessa, Kharkov, these places will likely be next, that we will continue. I mean, what do you think of the likelihood of a complete and utter destruction of Ukraine, a complete occupation, if they have to keep moving forward? The further west you go, the less likely those people are going to be willing to to agree to anything,
Right.
So it's just...
Yeah. No, it'll be a mess. Yeah, no, there is, like I say, with regard to the conflict in the Middle East, I don't see a happy ending. But I think you could say the same thing about Ukraine, but actually, well, compared to the Middle East, it would be pretty happy, relatively speaking. I don't see it ending, because at least on the Russian side, the Kremlin will not be in flames. That will not happen. I think the Russians will achieve their goals. But whether they decide to go all the way to the Polish border, or if they stop, let's say, at the Dnieper in the north, and then Odessa, Nikolaev, and maybe, on to Transnistria in the south, whether they settle for, let's say, the predominantly Russian parts of the country, or they actually go all the way and take all of Ukraine. It's going to be, Ukraine will be a festering wound either way. If they leave Western Ukraine in the hands of the Banderites, it's going to be a country that is still dedicated to the destruction of Russia, and it will have willing supporters in Europe. And, maybe they can't, I don't think they can ever actually threaten Russia's existence, but there will be terrorist attacks. There will be, it'll never end entirely. So, anybody that's within missile range of Ukraine is going to have to, just live with that uncertainty, even in Russian territory. But then, if they do go all the way to the Polish border, then they'll have to deal with an insurgency. I think there's just no question about it. If they stay within the Russian-speaking areas, they don't. We've seen that, actually. Again, in the Don, there is no insurgency. There are the occasional, unfortunately, in the past, rather frequent assassinations that were carried out by Kiev. And Kiev has actually admitted to that. I think Budanov admitted to that not too long ago. But then you would have a real insurgency on if you go to the West, you'll have a real insurgency on your hand. That's the sad truth. So either way, it's ugly. I mean, it still will be better than what we have, I think. Definitely. I mean, you're not, maybe at least 1,000 people, 1,000 soldiers are dying every day. That count's going to go way down, but there will be this festering wound. The violence won't stop completely, and there's always a potential, anyway, for an outbreak of war. Though I think, again, if the Russians take, especially if they take Odessa, if they take all the Black Sea coast, and then Ukraine is just a landlocked country, it's going to be much less of a threat. Part of the problem, of course, has been this access to the Black Sea. They have been able to attack Russian ships with some effect, and that's just the new technology of warfare. Ships are a lot more vulnerable than they used to be, but they won't be able to get their drones, launch their drones from the coast anymore. It'll be virtually impossible for them to do that. So that, it does reduce the threat to Russia, but it doesn't eliminate the threat to Russia entirely. If they attain the objectives that Putin has set out as the next stage, if the other side doesn't accept his current proposal.
What would you do?
I I think I would be very reluctant to go into Western Ukraine. Maybe I'm just a softie. Some people like Mark Sloboda said, he says, yeah, it's terrible, but you just have to do it. The only way to really end this is just to to go in and kill the Banderites. These people are just never going to stop fighting. And I don't have the stomach for that, but I'm not presidential material. I just don't know what the right thing to do is.
Yeah, it seems a bit extreme. I mean, that's a dangerous path to say you have to root out all of the Banderites, because you have this problem where doing things like that can generate more. This is. I think that you have to, if you get international recognition and it diplomatically, don't overreact. And I think that's what's great about Putin, is that he is slow, he is cautious, he is firm. I hope he doesn't go all the way to the Polish border, because I think that, like you said, I think that will be a mess, and I think that will open up a whole other can of worms that they don't want to deal with. But
yeah, well, I think people look at maybe World War II and it's just a total victory by the Allies over the Axis powers, and say, and they really did destroy, let's say, fascism in those countries. They were able to uproot it. But there's, at huge human cost, of course. But also, there's a difference. If Russia goes to the Polish border, and they violently suppress an insurgency, which again I think would be very costly to them too, and maybe not particularly popular within Russia. The problem is that this country, this Western Ukraine, the rump state that would, that they would be in control of, is surrounded by, or not entirely surrounded, but nearly so, by hostile powers that would. This is when Germany was finally defeated, there weren't any, powers hostile to Russia is what I say, but powers friendly to the insurgents. Mm-hmm. And you didn't have anything like that in Germany, right? So when Germany was defeated, it was utterly defeated. There was no power elsewhere in Europe that would support them, but you would have much of Europe still supporting this insurgency. So even if the Russians marched to the border, there would be a constant problem of insurgents crossing the border and receiving arms shipments, and I think it would be a mistake. And
right,
I don't think Putin would do it. I think that he's shown a reluctance to, again, he's a cautious man, but when he makes a decision, he's been a real decision. He's firm about it, and we've seen that with that statement he made back in June. He's held to it, and now he's actually incrementally expanding it.
Right. Well, you said that the Ukrainians have been carrying out multiple attacks on Russian energy infrastructure, but Russia hasn't responded in kind. Have they been making any moves on the front line as well, or do you think that they're kind of just pumping the brakes to allow for this educational process to settle in?
I don't think there's any sign that they're slowing things down. Again, we saw a real acceleration through the fall of last year and all the way, into the early winter. And then I think the main thing that happened was the Rasputica. Yeah, there was a very warm January. They had a brief, cold snap again in February, but then it actually became warm again. So, conditions have not been conducive to Russian advances. But the Russian advances, though, the acceleration has stopped that we saw earlier. With the exception, of course, of Kursk, where we saw, again, a real collapse on the part of the Ukrainians. Though it hasn't been accelerated, it still is considerable. I mean, it's just every day another village or two is taken, and at different points along the line. And, some places like Toretsk that were actually the Ukrainians counterattacked, retook some portion of the city. They've been pushed out, and actually the Russians are expanding from Toretsk. And yeah, they continue to advance along other parts of the line, and yeah, they're advancing too into Sumy, um, as they're pushing out the final remnants of the force, the Ukrainian force in Kursk. I think they have like maybe one hamlet left. Again, it's just a very the Ukrainians have virtually nothing there. It just doesn't make any sense to hang on to that one hamlet, but it obviously matters to Zelensky. I think next to his painting of the Kremlin in flames, he had a painting of the Ukrainians advancing in Kursk. In his imagination, this was some sort of great Churchillian achievement of some sort. But so he's not abandoning, but they are being pushed out. And as they're being pushed out of Kursk, and there's very, very little of them left there, the Russians are advancing, making steady advances into Sumy.
We had that this Kursk encirclement where Trump also said that he was talking to Putin, spare these people's lives, and then Zelensky was saying there are no troops encircled. Do we know what happened to that? They had a deadline to say to surrender and lay down their arms or be wiped out, and then we never heard anything.
Yeah, I think that deadline expired more than a week ago, and I think it's like that very small force, from what I understand. It's hard to get accurate information because it is a combat zone and it's very fluid, and it's journalists approach that area at great cost. They get information from soldiers, but it may be partial and not entirely reliable. But the reports that I've heard is that there are troops that are essentially encircled. I don't know how many. If we're talking about a few hundred or a couple thousand Ukrainian troops, but right there, on the border. Some of them, within that sliver of land that Ukraine still holds in Kursk, and the others in Sumy. The Russians are attacking from the flanks in Sumy and then pushing directly from Kursk, and there are troops that are essentially encircled. I don't think it's a total encirclement, but it's, maybe for all practical purposes it is. If they turn and try to run, they have to go across fields that are just under total Russian fire control.
Scary. Another thing you mentioned during these talks in Riyadh was the sanctions relief with the Black Grain deal. And I was just thinking, there's been so many sanctions that we've placed. It seems very easy to put sanctions on countries, but it seems very difficult to remove them. You said it's unlikely. You think this will happen. We saw the same thing. We see it everywhere. We saw it with Iran as well. With JCPOA, we had this agreement. They did everything they were supposed to do. We didn't remove the sanctions. Right. Trump comes into office. I was thinking, well, one of the easiest things he could do to help restore relations is ease up on some of these sanctions. Obviously it seems like a good thing to do because it hasn't hurt Russia. It's actually hurt Europe and the United States more than it's actually hurt Russia. So what's the point of putting on these sanctions? Instead, we saw more sanctions get put on. So I think I'm wondering, is there just some, there's that famous Milton Friedman quote, there's nothing more permanent than a temporary government program. Is this kind of the situation that we're seeing with sanctions? Is once you put it in place, it's like, well, there's too much paperwork to remove it. So we gotta, what is it that makes it so difficult to remove sanctions, but so easy to put on sanctions? Yeah.
Well, I think actually in that case, Milton Friedman is right. And I think it's part of that kind of that general phenomenon that we observe in government. A new agency is created. It never is never abolished. Trump is trying to do that right now. I don't know if he's going to have success, like with the Department of Education. But in general, it's just never does anybody say, like 3 years down the road, hey, this didn't really work out. This is not producing the benefits we thought it would. Let's close this program down. Those programs always have a way of expanding. What you do is, in essence, you create an interest group. And for them, the maintenance and expansion of their particular program or agency is existential. That's their jobs or whatever, and they will fight tooth and nail to hang on to and convince everybody that they're extremely important. So these agencies, they just stay forever. And it's the same thing with sanctions. I think part of it is that there ends up being kind of there will be a group of of people, some ideologically motivated, others motivated by financial gain that, say have a real interest in maintaining the sanctions, and they will fight tooth and nail to prevent their elimination or their repeal. To give you an example, there were sanctions that were actually imposed on the Soviet Union, and I think it was all the way back in the 1970s. And with respect to like Jewish immigration from Soviet Union. I'm trying to remember the something Levitsky Act. But the Soviet Union fell, right? and the Russian Federation was established. It wasn't until 20 years after the establishment of the Russian Federation that act was finally repealed. It was just there. There was no reason in the world for maintaining it. And then about a year afterwards, a new one that did almost exactly the same thing was imposed. So we have Putin actually telling the same union of industrialists and entrepreneurs, he said, don't expect the sanctions to go away. Even if, overall relations improve, he said, I'm being honest with you. These sanctions are here to stay for the foreseeable future. And so I think that's something that Russia accepts. And it's something, again, they show that they've weathered the sanctions. They've even, parts of the Russian economy really have thrived. And so they don't care. That's one thing the Americans said is like, the Russians aren't demanding that we remove the sanctions. I think they would be happy if they were removed, mainly as just a goodwill gesture. And, some of the sanctions, I think we have to be honest, some of them do cause economic harm to Russia. But the Russian economy has proven itself to be very resilient. Again, it's not a gas station masquerading as a country. It's actually a very complex, advanced, and diversified economy. And so it was able to absorb the sanctions and move on. And so it's not really a pressing, burning issue for them. So it would be good. It would make sense really more from our point of view, again, especially Europe's. But, we are talking about maybe ending the sanctions. Sometimes we get murmurings of that from within the administration. But the Europeans seem to be adamant. They seem to be adamant about their own demise. It's a kind of a suicide pact in Europe.
Yeah, you feel like the only solution now would just to be get rid of all the sanctions. We just got to cut through them. Like they're not working. They never work. They always cause problems. I mean, what do you say? There was 25,000 sanctions on Russia?
Well, I heard it was, a couple months ago, I heard it was 24,311. And then more recently, I heard a figure of northwards of 29,000. So I don't know what's right. But anyway, an awful lot.
A lot. And I mean, so you think about, that's just Russia. I mean, we sanction, a third of the countries in the world are sanctioned by the United States.
Yeah.
It's like it's so many that we can't even keep up with it. And if Russia has almost 25 to 30,000 sanctions on it, think about Iran, it's probably about 1 million sanctions we have on there. Nobody keeps up on it. But it's, like you said, it's this problem that the government has become such a large machine with all these interest groups that are created that are these parasites that are just suckling on the teat of it that will keep it entrenched in place. It's gotten so big that I think the only way to do it is just say we just have to axe all of it. You can't go through each one and try to address every single interest group that's in place. And I wonder if that's possible. It just feels like that's the whole problem with the U.S. government in general. It's just gotten so big, so much lobbying that it's no longer able to function, and nobody wants to touch any program because it sets off alarm bells and people don't want to deal with it.
Yeah. Well, I think it really is impossible because the sanctions, I think the vast majority of them were done with the consent of Congress, and Congress would require a say in the lifting of the sanctions, and we just don't have, I think it's clear to me that you're just not going to get the votes, maybe with the exception of a few sanctions, but the other 29,000 or, however many that the hundreds of thousands that exist across the world, I think they're here to stay for a long time. It's very unfortunate, but I think that's the case.
Right. Yeah, I mean, think about it. There's all these congressmen, all these politicians, all the lobbying power that is gone, all the money that's going in to keep certain things in place, keep certain policies in place, vote a certain way. This seems to be the fundamental problem with our system now, right? It's just we have to remove this lobbying influence. Like, I don't know how to feel about this. Like democracy, the idea is great, but if you have it with this lobbying, and we like say capitalism, it's a great thing. People can strive and make as much money as they want to achieve, but if you're able to use that money to just push policy that you want to benefit yourself at the expense of everybody else, that's clearly a problem.
Yeah.
And is that fixable?
Well, in theory, it is. It seems like to me that decades ago, I heard a lot more talk about, reducing the influence of the lobbyists. It almost seems like there were real efforts, but now I don't even hear about it so much. It seems like, we have just given up. It's just sort of like, that's the way things are. Let's be realistic. And it's a real problem. You're right. It's well, in theory, we're a democratic society, which is, I know that really it's more correct to say that we're a republic, but democratic in the sense that our government is supposed to reflect the will of the people. And that's, the same is true of Europe, but it's clear that there is an elite in charge in all these countries that do not reflect the will of the people. And seem to be impervious to the results of elections. Now there is, an interesting battle going on in the U.S. Between Trump and his, his people, his appointees, and the deep state. So when I'm talking about the elite, like kind of the permanent political class, we can also call them the deep state. Now it's just not clear to me. And he's had some real victories. Again, we've talked about those earlier. But he himself is kind of, I don't think you want to put too much hope in this man. I mean, we have to give him credit where credit is due. But he is up against a very powerful opponent. It's, and even when he has these victories, I think, we forget about the fact that deep state, it's taken some blows, but it's still there. And it's going to be, the problem isn't going to go away. It's not, it may be that we'll see what happens, if he can win some, affect some permanent changes, then you say, well, okay, maybe there's a hope that this permanent, elite, this deep state, really has been contained, or, its power has been significantly reduced. And then we'll have governments in the future that are more reflective of the popular will, and therefore in that sense, more democratic. But, the battle is far from over. And it may be that like the deep state survives this, and then actually will consolidate its power and just make sure that this never happens again. That we'll see something like what we've seen in Romania, for example, or what we're seeing in Moldova right now.
Oof. Yeah. If we're a democracy or a republic, the government's supposed to reflect the will of the people, but that's clearly not the case anymore. If it's really more accurate to say that we have a government that reflects the will of the lobby. So what would you describe that government being? What kind of government is that? Do we have a term for that?
Yeah, that's interesting. Do we actually have a term for that? I mean, I guess the term that we've been using is the deep state. It's just that,
deep state, I mean, corporate capture. But it's not only corporations, though. I mean, if you have things like APAC.
Yeah, exactly. Because I think you make a mistake sometimes to try to, I think some people on the left make the mistake of trying to explain everything in terms of financial gain. And they're right to point to that. That's part of it. Part of it is corporate capture, especially in the area of regulation. There's no question about it. But there are also ideologues. And those ideologues, will pursue policies that actually may not benefit corporations, but they pursue them nonetheless. So like in places like the State Department and also the security state, you find, the ideologues are in charge. in Pentagon, we see both of it. Maybe we see more of it is about financial gain, right? Again, we've talked about all these very expensive weapon systems. Why do we have them? Well, because people make a lot of money out of it. That's part of what's going on, no question about it.
Do we have solutions? Or I mean, would you say that this is really kind of the biggest problem pressing the West in general? Everybody knows that the West is in trouble, but sometimes it's hard to explain why exactly we get lost in the weeds and start focusing on one little thing. But if we take a step back, it's really just the main problem that we have is this capture by lobbies. Would that be the main thing, or is it ideological capture as well? There's the military-industrial complex.
Right.
I mean,
right. Yeah. When we talk about lobbies, some of them are ideological, and I think APAC is an example of that. And then others are, clearly driven by financial greed. We have both. And I think you're right. That's kind of the larger problem. It's just sort of you could call it sort of late stage capitalism or democratic capitalism. I'm just thinking about Francis Fukuyama's, End of History, a paper that he published back in the 1990s. That time it just seemed like this was the model that everybody wanted to emulate. It was free markets and democracy. That's essentially what it was, and that was the model that clearly worked, and the whole world would aspire to. And once the whole world achieved it, that would be the end of history. Obviously that hasn't, things haven't turned out the way that he predicted. And one of the problems, it's not just that there is resistance in other parts of the world, but the model itself has been, is looking less and less attractive to the rest of the world. And it is, I think, this very corrupt relationship that has been established between corporations and the government. And then the capture of a lot of policies by certain ideological groups and that are just impervious to, increasingly are just divorced from reality and impervious to popular sentiment. That is a real threat to this whole model. The model itself is in bad shape and desperately needs to be reformed. It's a tough battle. I don't know if it can be, if the whole thing, just the whole system has to be sort of, it's I think we should try, but we may just not succeed. And maybe the whole system has to be, taken apart, and then we have to start all over again. But that's very easily said, but, that's going to be a long, very painful and, potentially bloody process.
Right. Yeah. I feel like it's not possible when I look at our politicians, our Congress, our Senate, and I see everybody, and there's only one Thomas Massey. There's like one guy in the whole government that doesn't seem to be ideologically captured or captured by these lobbyists in the way that the rest of our government is. So I'm just thinking like, maybe it just has to fall apart. Maybe we'll have a USSR type of moment where just all of a sudden it's not there, and then everybody, each state has to figure it out themselves. I mean, we do have some basic infrastructure as we do have state laws and state government, so it's theoretically it could work. But anyways, we're going down a path I wasn't really expecting. Maybe we can move over to the Middle East. Do you have any big updates for us over there?
Well, there's some very worrying developments. Of course, Trump has made these threats to Iran. He sent them, what in essence was an ultimatum. You make a deal within 2 months or else, and or else is military action. And it seems to be real, or at least he's actually, the U.S. government, the Pentagon is making moves to prepare for an attack on Iran. That's what appears to be happening. There were reports that, I don't know quite how many, 7 B-2 bombers were flown to Diego Garcia, which is a small island in the Indian Ocean, not too far from within range of Iran. And then a large number of air refueling aircraft have been deployed to the region too, or closer to Iran. As it looks like we are preparing for an attack, and that is very worrying. I'll have to say that this actually has a bearing on a practical impact on my life because your mother and I have been preparing to actually visit Iran to go on a tour and see, many of the cultural, historical sites in Iran sometime this summer. And, we haven't committed to, we've done all the paperwork, which was extensive, not surprisingly, but we haven't made a deposit yet. And now I'm just wondering if we should risk, because it really does look bad. Again, we may pull back, and maybe that this is just, theater, that it's an effort to just, apply pressure to Iran, but there's no intention. But there's no guarantee that this is theater. It could be for real.
Right. I imagine there are not a lot of people making leisure vacation flights to Tehran at this point in time. You probably might be the only one here in America that was just like, hey, telling your wife, hey, why don't we go visit Iran now? It seems. I think it would be great. I would love for you guys to go. Obviously, I was very excited when you told me that you're planning on going. But yeah, I understand completely. This is it's a scary situation. So you really think that the U.S. might try to do this? We're gearing up. Is this the closest, most real that you've seen us get to a potential strike on Iran?
Well, we got very close, actually, I think, under George W. Bush. He attacked Iraq, and then, like, the next one, it was Iran. He wanted to go after Iran. And he, like, every other administration, like the current administration, he was trying to use the threat of nuclear weapons in Iran as a pretext. But he was undercut by his own intelligence community, which they released an important, he was actually making moves in that direction. And of course, always with the support, the very, very enthusiastic support of the Israeli government. But before he was able to actually, carry out the attack, the U.S. intelligence community released a report saying that there's absolutely no evidence that Iran is attempting to develop a nuclear weapon. And that has been consistent ever since 2003. And I think, like Gareth Porter argues, that probably even the 2003 assessment was based on some false evidence. It's not clear that they ever really had that intention. So we've gotten close in the past. This is something, it is an ongoing story. It's just like there's always these people. Israel is the driver, and Netanyahu in particular. Netanyahu has been beating the war drums against Iran since approximately 30 years ago. I mean, that's how long it's been going on. And it's always using the threat, really the fabricated threat of Iranian nuclear weapons as his argument for an attack on Iran. And it's just every once in a while, you'll start to hear there are moves. And I think that, arrangements are being made, an attack is being carefully considered. The most recent was actually under Biden in the very last month or two of his administration, of his term. He was apparently, I don't know if Biden was even aware of what was going on, but Tony Blinken and Jake Sullivan and the rest of them seriously considered, launching an attack, of course, in cooperation with Israel against Iran. But they decided against it. But now, once again, probably comes down to Donald Trump himself, but we can see, there's some evidence that, some reasons to believe, let's just put it that way, that he will pull back at the end. But but I wouldn't just put a whole lot of faith in that. And unfortunately, it's not just him, but a lot of the people around him. A lot of these people, they're willing to, I don't think they really care about Ukraine and Russia one way or another. Some of them, I think, like Vance really does, and he does have a true understanding of what's happening in Ukraine. The others just don't care, but they're not ideological zealots the way that Tony Blinken and the previous administration was. They're not ideological zealots against Russia, but they are ideological zealots, unfortunately, against Iran. And so there's a real chance that this time they'll win the debate. That that Trump will go down on the side of the anti-Iran crazies and launch this attack.
Do they think that if they launch an attack on Iran, that Iran won't strike back? I mean, what are they thinking?
Yeah, I think Iran just has to if they do. And again, as we pointed out, there's just a lot of ways for Iran to do real damage, not just symbolic damage, but very serious damage to the U.S. military and to the U.S. economy.
Yeah, it seems suicidal if we do this and then Iran strikes back, wipes out some our bases in the Middle East, sinks some of our ships. What do you think the U.S. is going to do? The U.S. is going to just go full blown insane mode, but the whole world is going to be like, well, you struck them first. What do you expect? That you try to punch them and they're not allowed to punch back? Like we're going to be alone on this, right? It's just going to be Israel and the United States, right?
Probably, there's not going to be a whole lot of or very little international support. I think there's no question about it. There are a lot of people, I shouldn't say people, but governments in the anti-Iran camp, and some of them are in the Middle East, though they have shown actually, that was much truer several years ago than it is now. Since the accord that was reached between Iran and Saudi Arabia, you don't have the same hostility that you had against Iran that used to exist in the Middle East. Of course, you still have the Europeans, say they're angry that that the U.S. has abandoned them, with respect to Russia, but they're all still firmly united, unfortunately, when it comes to Iran. But yeah, I think the international support would be very limited. It would exist, but it would be very limited. But the thing is, I think it would be impossible or very difficult, let me put it this way, very, very difficult for any U.S. administration to suffer a humiliation, like let's say the sinking of an aircraft carrier or something to that effect, and not respond to, not escalate. That's the real danger. You go down that path, it could just escalate to something completely out of control. And it would be, we'll have to be honest, it would be very bad for Iran. It would be bad for everybody involved. It could be just a real, I don't even want to think about it, but
Yeah, but I mean, I try to play it out because there's only a few steps you have to take, right? I mean, we strike Iran strikes back, sinks an aircraft carrier, wipes out some bases, and then what's next? We don't have the logistics in place to be able to carry something out. Do we go straight to going and dropping nukes, like launch an ICBM? I mean, that clearly doesn't seem to be okay, right? So it's just like, I don't know if we've thought this through. Like, well, how's this? How did they expect this to play out?
Right.
It just doesn't play out in our benefit at all.
Yeah. Well, I think that's the reason why we have pulled back from the abyss in the past. Starting with George W. Bush and at least a few times since then. There are times when, I think real consideration was given to an attack on Iran. Again, the pressure from the Israeli government has been constant. They're always pushing for it. And often supplying false intelligence and so on and so forth. But we've always, it seems like we've always, the realists have always won out because I think they just have a very powerful argument. And you're just, you're making that. And I just hope that gets through to Trump that, hey, this could tank the economy. This could be a real humiliation for the U.S. military. Yeah, you might actually really kill a lot of Iranians and destroy some of their infrastructure, but it won't be a winner for us. Just put it like that. It's not you're going to have a huge mess on your hands. And maybe Trump, he's shown that with regard to other conflicts. He seems to be reluctant to get involved in another war. Of course, he's involved in a war with Yemen right now with the Houthis, but the Houthis really can't strike back against the U.S. Maybe potentially they will. Eventually some missile will get through. But, though they've done extraordinary things, I think there's still, there's a huge power imbalance. It's not the thing is the U.S. can't wipe out the Houthis. The Houthis will always stand and they'll be able to continue to impose a blockade on Israeli-linked shipping in the Red Sea. But there's not a real danger to the U.S. itself. I don't think, I might, if the Houthis end up getting some ship-killing missiles from Iran or Russia or something, then, maybe that'll change. But I think at the present, they're not really capable of humiliating the U.S. Navy in the Red Sea. But Iran is, and that's really different. And maybe if Trump understands that, I hope he does. I'm sure there are people telling him that. Maybe he will pull back. Maybe this is theater. Maybe like the attack on the Houthis, well, that was partly like just to put pressure on Iran. He thought, well, we're going to put real pressure on Iran, and we're going to, move these B-2 bombers to Diego Garcia. We're going to make it look like we're going to get them, and then that'll force them to come to the negotiating table. Now, but if they don't come to the negotiating table, they've said that they're just not going to negotiate. Maybe they will, just because, and I couldn't blame them. There's part of me that's saying you just need to stand strong. But then you say, this war would be so awful. Maybe you just make some kind of small gesture. Yeah, okay, that'll be interpreted as a sign of weakness, but maybe it's just realism and, and in the interest of your nation and of the region. That's something that Scott Ritter has been arguing. Scott Ritter is no pacifist, but he's saying, Iran probably should just do something. Maybe work some deal with the help of the Russians, work out something so that they can avert this. I don't know.
Yep.
They're in a tough position. The Iranians are.
Right, but it's kind of a kicking the can down the road type of thing, right?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, at the end of the day, you still have to address the root problem, and that's what's happening in Gaza and Palestine, and the fact that Israel is just hell-bent on destroying Iran. As long as this axis of resistance exists, and it will continue, it's growing substantially, actually. I think that Israel and the U.S. needs to understand that these actions that they're taking are really strengthening the axis of resistance. Just in terms of global support, so many people around the world weren't really aware. No, most people probably didn't even know about Yemen. And, I was listening to Pepe Escobar on Nima's show Dialogue Works the other day. And, Pepe Escobar is in Yemen. And he was just talking about just how amazing it was that how these people that were, so poor, but have become just this explosion, this huge pride in their nation that they're doing this for a moral reason. That's, and this is resonating throughout the world. He's saying how, like, I forget the guy's name, Yahya, the spokesperson for the Iranians. You see him on X, Twitter, making the announcements. This guy, he's like a celebrity in China and around the world. We may not see it here, but around the world, everybody is so many people are rooting for this guy, and it makes sense because we're in. And even here within the United States and Europe, I think we're seeing that resonate as well. Because we're living in a world that's, I feel like, it's being increasingly devoid of morality. And then we have the Houthis that are a truly moral force. And people are attracted to that, like a moth to a flame. They want to support
maybe
this.
Not a moth to a flame.
Okay, maybe that's
right.
for
the moth. Right?
Okay, right. Sorry, but you know what I mean. That people are attracted to that. They're like, this is a moral cause. These are people that are standing up, and they want to see these people stand up, and they're giving this so much support. And the more that we bomb them or Israel goes after them, the greater that support's going to be. And it's counterproductive, the policies that Israel and the United States are taking. And if you are a supporter of Israel, I think they should recognize that you think that this is not the right way to go. Bombing the Houthis, and definitely not bombing Iran. That's going to be that'll be the end of Israel if they do that. I think so.
Well, it could be. I mean, it certainly is going to be. Again, Iran could really threaten Israel in a way that these other powers, Gaza or the Yemenis. The Yemenis can get an occasional missile through and do some damage, but it's not going to really threaten Israel. But Iran could take out Israel's infrastructure, military or industrial, its ports. It could do those things. And again, Israel's a small country. It would be a huge, huge blow. So, yeah, it seems very, very foolish. But again, they just, Netanyahu and his ultra-nationalist government has put Israel on this really apocalyptic course.
Just a few
But one thing
short questions.
I just
Okay,
thought
go.
of, because you were talking about the Houthis and how they're finding supporters around the world. I actually heard that from your mother this morning, who follows certain, Taiwanese news sources very closely. Now, these are Taiwanese news sources that are kind of anti-Western hegemony, so they're not maybe not the typical sources within Taiwan. But she said, yeah, there's people even in Taiwan are celebrating what they call the Sandal Army. That's the Houthis.
Right, it's a great story. It's like Star Wars and the rebels fighting the Empire type of thing.
Yeah.
We'll see how it all plays out, but I think that they're not scared of being bombed. They've been bombed constantly. I just saw a video the other day of a Yemeni shopkeeper in Sana'a, and a U.S. bomb went off right nearby. Huge explosion. The guy didn't even look around to look at the explosion. He was just still there. Do you think? And then another one hit, and he just kind of casually looked around. Wasn't even phased. And I think people have to understand that these people have been under horrific bombing campaign from the Saudis and the American, backed by the Americans for 7-8 years, where hundreds of thousands were killed. And so for this is just it's another Tuesday for them. I don't think they're going to be phased. I mean, that's kind of sad to say, but
yeah, it is sad.
Okay, there's one other thing I want to ask you is I saw on X the other day trending these anti-Hamas protests in Gaza, and they were being pushed. All the accounts were the pro-Israeli accounts, and I wonder, is there any truth to this? I couldn't see any verification about it. If it's just all fake news, there's just, and I couldn't hear. I don't speak Arabic, so I don't know what they're saying. So, do you know anything about that?
I actually don't, which makes me think that it's probably phony. Because there are enough honest people on the anti-Zionist side that when they, when something like that happens, they will report it. I'll see it from there's certain sources I know are quite reliable, and I haven't heard anything. So I think it probably is just pure propaganda. We'll wait and see. Maybe there's something to it, but at this point I'm very, very skeptical about those reports.
Okay, well, last one. Do you have any thoughts on this Signal chat fiasco?
Yeah, I don't have a whole lot to say about it. I think people should know that Jeffrey Goldberg, that's the editor of the Atlantic magazine, that was mistakenly included in this chat, that he has a long history of being just an ultra-Zionist, and he was actually instrumental in the attack on Iran back in 2003. He was part of that. Unfortunately, so much of the American media went along with the weapons of mass destruction narrative, the need to invade Iraq. He was part of that. He's a very important figure even way back then, and he helped to make it happen. He has been very firmly in the Zionist camp. So I think, one of the stories, of course, this shows real sloppiness on the part of I guess in particular, Mike Waltz. I think he was the one that mainly responsible for this. But it also makes you wonder, I think, in fact, we should not be surprised that he had these contacts with Jeffrey Goldberg, because Jeffrey Goldberg is actually a real he is passionately opposed to the Trump administration. But when it comes to Zionism, then, find these enemies are all on the same page, unfortunately. And I think that's just another sign that there hasn't been any significant change in direction under Trump when it comes to the Middle East. Just the fact that Jeffrey Goldberg was, in communication with Mike Waltz, and then, so, I think that's just the point that I want to make there.
Okay. All right. Well, we can end it there. Okay, Dad. Have a good rest of your day.
You too.
And talk to you on Friday. Or I'll probably see you tomorrow. But
all right.
okay. All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.